Welcome, everyone. The webinar will begin at the top of the hour and will be recorded. Connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account @ReadingByThird. Please use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learned from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Once again, the campaign wants to connect with you on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account @ReadingByThird. The webinar will begin shortly and it will be recorded and shared with you afterwards.
Welcome everybody to today's webinar, Underconnected Yet Eager to Learn, Confronting Digital Inequities, part of our Learning Loss Recovery webinar series, which we kicked off this morning in a previous webinar. I'm Yoli Flores, Chief Learning Officer for the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you all for joining us. I'll get us started with just a few housekeeping details. First, we'd love you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Please be sure to select panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting questions in the Q&A box. We will spend the last 20 minutes or so responding to the questions you post during the discussion. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed next week to all who registered. And finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation or survey during the Q&A, and we highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. Before we begin, I'll say just a brief word about our GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar series. The campaign launched GLR Learning Tuesdays as part of our commitment to bring the GLR network a more predictable and a more reliable set of learning opportunities, meaning that you can rely on high-value learning webinars every Tuesday at 3 o'clock Eastern. Our webinars serve as a portal to access and explore the best science, ideas, strategies, and programs for our work to ensure early school success for more children from low-income families. Since the launch of GLR Learning Tuesdays, we've produced over 35 incredibly rich webinars, all of which are archived on our Community Learning for Impact and Improvement platform, or CLIP. I'll share the link to CLIP during this session in the Q&A box. Jerry, if you could advance the slide. On this screen, you'll see the next two webinars on learning loss recovery. Starting with June 2nd, the science of learning loss, and then on June 9th, the essential home supports for families and caregivers. Later in June, we'll focus on the role of broadcast media to support parents and children, strategies by policymakers, and how superintendents are planning the reopening of schools as they ensure alignment between the early years and the early grades. So with all those details out of the way, let's get started. As I shared earlier today, today's webinar is part of our Learning Loss Recovery series that will extend over several weeks. The campaign is lifting up the issue of learning loss to acknowledge and confront the very real threat presented by the COVID slide. Unless mitigated and reversed, the COVID slide will diminish the prospects that children from economically challenged families and communities will attain the early school success that predicts high school graduation and a path towards self-sufficiency. Today, We will examine the current state of digital inequity in the United States and start to unpack what this crisis means for millions of early learners and their families that have been effectively shut out of the digital learning during this pandemic because of lack of devices, connectivity, and/or online support. Our presenters and community commentators will delve into the scope, the extent, and the dimensions of these inequities as we look for solutions to help bridge the digital divides. So with that, let me introduce you to our moderator and our presenters. And I'll say just a few words about our community commentators who will be introduced a little bit later. So first is our moderator, Lisa Guernsey. Lisa is director of the Teaching, Learning, and Tech Program and senior advisor to the Early and Elementary Education Policy Program at New America. Guernsey focuses on new approaches to help students and families succeed in the digital age, and her work involves leading teams of analysts and writers to translate research, examine policies, and generate new ideas for developing high-quality learning opportunities for underserved and historically disadvantaged populations. Prior to her work at New America, Guernsey was a staff writer at the New York Times and the Chronicle of Higher Education, and has contributed to various national publications. She is also co-author with Michael Levine of Tap, Click, Read, Growing Readers in a World of Screens. And now our presenters. Vikki Katz is an associate professor in the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers University. She conducts research with children growing up in low-income, working class, and immigrant families. She investigates how family technology use influences skills development and access to learning resources, and how digital inequality affects learning opportunities for children. Her research has been supported by the Spencer, Grable, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations, and she is author of more than 30 articles, books, and reports. Dr. Katz also currently serves as co-editor of Journal of Children and Media and the board of directors for the National Center for Families Learning. Next is Joshua Steger. He is senior counsel at New America's Open Technology Institute. He specializes in telecommunications law and digital equity policy, including OTI's longstanding efforts to close the digital divide and protect net neutrality. Prior to OTI, Steger was a law fellow to Senator Al Franken, a legislative aide to Congresswoman Betty McCollum, and an assistant editor at Congressional Quarterly. He earned a JD from New York University and a BA from George Washington University. And our two community commentators who will be introduced in just a moment are Tina Hike-Hubbard with Baltimore City Public Schools and Elizabeth Galicia with Common Sense Media. I am now delighted and honored to welcome Lisa Guernsey, a key partner, thought leader, collaborator with the campaign, who will moderate today's webinar. So Lisa, it's all yours.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Yoli, and really great to be with everybody. I'm going to take just a second here to share my screen and get us started. And hopefully you can all hear me. Okay, so I just want to say thanks for having me. This is going to be a really important conversation, and I'm so glad to be able to help and to moderate with it. Before we get started in the conversation, I wanted to share a couple of slides to just set the context here. Because if we're going to have a conversation about how to recover from learning loss, we really are going to need to better understand what is lost and why. And digital inequality and the inequities that we're going to talk about today really will be, sadly, a part of why, and we really need to understand that. So as everyone knows, right, we're in this just incredibly tough time, and schools across the country are closed, buildings are closed, as well as childcare centers and early learning centers and state pre-K programs. And there are some childcare centers that are certainly still open for our essential workers, but for the most part, our children and our students today are learning at home. So this means that their parents are helping to find ways to make sure that they have that learning environment at home. And for many of these kids, this means that they're using tablets and computers. They're doing Zoom calls with teachers. They're drawing on tablets, perhaps. They're even maybe listening to story times on Facebook Live, hopefully with family members as well, or teachers are guiding them to do that. They may even be going to new resources online, like wideopenschool.org, which Common Sense Media has put together. And I'm just showing you a screenshot of that here right now, just to show you that there really are all sorts of really helpful resources that have been collected. But to really be able to tap into this array of digital resources that in very creative ways people have been putting together for our young children at home, our students, our children, our families are going to need access at home. They're going to need to be able to get online. And online learning is only going to work if, of course, they have that access at home in the first place. We, a couple of weeks ago, actually, now I see the date here. In fact, it's been almost 2 months ago. One of my colleagues on the Teaching, Learning, and Tech team, Savia Prescott, who's also with us on this webinar today, she wrote a piece about what we know about internet access at home for students. There are holes in the data. There's a lot we still need to better understand. But some of the statistics that come out of her piece here are that maybe as many as 12 million children in the United States who do not have internet access at home. From another set of data, we see that about 17% of school-age students do not have broadband internet access at home. And Sabia has also done some writing to show that not all teachers have high-speed internet access at home either. And this may very much be the case for our child care and preschool teachers who are often working at very, very low wages, and paying for internet access at home is something that's a real strain on their finances. So these are the critical issues that we're going to try to tackle here today to better understand what's at stake for these kids. I'll just quickly note that at New America, these are issues where we're really focused on pretty strongly expanding access to and the quality of online learning and digital materials for all students, modernizing teacher prep and professional development, building stronger supports for most vulnerable students, and really elevating this vital connection between care and learning that we'll also be talking about, I think, a lot in this webinar today, recognizing that these are students in families that have a lot that they can bring to the table, but supporting those families and having that kind of sense of care throughout will be critical. So I will stop sharing my screen here now and turn us over to talk with Vikki Katz, who will be the first one up. Vikki, I'm so thrilled to have you with us. The work that you've done over the years has informed me greatly in our work at New America. And I wonder if you could get us started by just helping us understand the work that you've been doing since, I know that in 2016 there was a big report that you put out with Vikki Rideout through the Joan Gantz Cooney Center, and you've been really looking at these issues of digital equity. Tell us what you know about the state of equity today for our digital equity today for our young kids based on that.
Well, thank you everybody for being here under these completely bizarre conditions, and thank you very much for having me on. I think everybody has had some level of increased empathy for what digital inequality feels like over the last few weeks, whether it's been breaks in your own connectivity or the internet slowed down by many people being online in your home at the same time that maybe would have been at school or at work during the day. And so these are some of the things that I just wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of. This is our map of a connected America with the little computer gadgets inside there in some of the states. But let's go to the next slide. I'm going to just give you a few brief highlights today from the work we've done on this issue, but I invite you to learn more by going to digitalequityforlearning.org, where you can find all the reports and connections and updates on this work around how technology influences learning opportunities for lower income families with school-age kids across the United States. A lot of what I'll be talking about today is going to draw on the national survey that we did in 2016 that looks at families of all backgrounds, but in the bottom half of incomes. So families that at that time were earning $65,000 a year or less and had children in either elementary or middle school, about how digital inequality was affecting children's access to learning and opportunity in and out of school. And then qualitative work before and after that with immigrant families of Mexican heritage, African American, and white families in different communities all over the country. So these are just a few of the highlights that I wanted to share with you, because I think having a sense of where things are in kind of more routine times also gives us a sense of how we can meet families where they are now. Next slide, please. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is family connectivity. And so if you look at the next slide, we ask families questions about their internet access. And if you look at this, it would seem that we're doing fairly well. You know, that 94% of families that were surveyed said that they had internet access. You can see about 2/3 of those said they had home broadband, about a quarter said that they only had access through a mobile device, usually a smartphone. Dial-up accounted for 5% and no access for about 6%. But it's a lot more complicated than that. And any survey that only asks a question, and this is a good thing to remember if you're part of an organization that might be surveying families about these issues, if you only ask whether or not people have internet access as a yes or no question, or whether or not they have a laptop or a smartphone as a yes or no question, you're only scratching the surface of most people's experiences. Because if we look on the next slide, you'll see that the yes or no access question is not enough, because anyone, you know, who's spent time working with lower income families knows that it depends when you ask that question, what their experience is. For parents who had home broadband access, when we asked them about the last 12 months, you can see 1 in 5 had their service cut off for an inability to pay. Even at that time, and this is before everybody was crowded in learning at home at the same time, 1 in 4 said that too many people are sharing the computer for them to feel that they have enough time on it, and that 1/3 said that their service was too slow. For those with mobile-only access, you can see that too many people sharing devices, service being cut off for an inability to pay, you're between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4, and then almost 1/3 have hit their data limits before the end of the month. And so we talk about families being underconnected rather than thinking of the digital divide as a yes or no. And we think of underconnected as people being less connected than they would like to be, not less connected than anyone else thinks they should be. I think that distinction is very important. It's whether or not you have the levels of quality, consistent connectivity to be able to do the things you want to do, or you don't. And so, again, these are data that were collected during more routine times. It doesn't feel like much of a stretch to think that these numbers would look much higher in a national survey that was done just now. Another thing to remember is that mobile-only access is a form of digital inequality all by itself. When we ask adults what kinds of things they do online, you can see that those with mobile-only access are doing less online than those who have home broadband access. They're using it less to get news, to pay bills, or do online banking, which can save a lot of time. And in the coming months, or perhaps a year or more, is going to be another way to stay out of an enclosed space while the pandemic is still a threat to people's health. Shopping online, which might seem fairly frivolous, but in many neighborhoods, having to buy things at the corner store might mean you're paying a large markup versus deals you might be able to get online. And again, saves people who may be vulnerable to this disease from being in closed spaces. And people are applying for jobs and services that they qualify for less if they only have a mobile phone than if they have broadband. This doesn't just affect adults. Please click. You can see this is affecting children too, because children who only have access through a mobile device are almost 20% less likely. And again, we're comparing them to other lower income families. We're not comparing them to kids who come from wealthy families. But you can see there's statistically significant differences, but even descriptively, almost 20 points between kids based purely on whether or not they're mobile only, in terms of whether or not they're going online every day, which is one of the key robust indicators of whether or not kids can do what they want to do online, but also whether or not they're looking up things they're interested in, not things their teachers think they should be doing, not things their parents think they should be doing, but whether they're able to engage in learning for the joy of it and interest-driven learning. And we think that that's something that's really important to note as well. Next slide, please. And so in that, sort of very brief look at something that I'm very happy to talk in greater depth when we have Q&A, the bottom line to take from that is that most families have access, but they may not have as much access or this kind of quality, consistent access that they would like, and that it's about more than connectivity. It's about the quality of your devices, and it's about the environment in which you're using them, whether or not people are sharing them amongst too many people and so forth. And so most families have access. They don't have as much as they want or need, but the next part that I'm going to show you is that reinforces that they're doing the best they can with what they have. And so in interviews that we conducted, hour-long interviews in multiple languages in families' homes, parents and kids separately, we saw over and over again that families and within families, that parents and children returning to each other and forming what we think of as digital learning teams. And that's a term that came from one of the parents that we spoke with. He talked about the family being a team that achieves things together, that when he doesn't know how to do something, his wife helps, or they ask their older son, their other son, the one we weren't interviewing, that they solve the problem together, and that technology becomes a form of engagement and can be a form of engagement and a way for families to learn together. On the next slide, you'll see that when we surveyed families after doing those interviews, we asked parents how often they help their children to do the things that in the interviews we did with almost 350 parents and children, families told us that they do most often at home. We're learning how the device itself works, troubleshooting problems that go wrong, finding, and if we were interviewing them in Spanish, translating information that they found online and downloads. And we asked parents how often they help their children to do these things and how often their children help them to do these things, so that we could start to get a sense of who was doing what in this sort of broader national scale. And what we found was the parents that tend to lead the way across all of these domains are the ones who have college education, whether they've finished a degree or not, those who speak English as their primary language. And we found that even when those two things were controlled for, that white families tended to report parents leading the way, more so than in African American and English dominant Hispanic families, where we saw more of a free back and forth between what kids help parents with and what parents help kids with, which suggests the kinds of cultural sort of maybe greater flexibilities that might exist across families in terms of who feels that it's okay to ask their children to help them with things and to not be the expert all the time, and who feels like that's a role they have to protect and hold on to. The families that were most likely to have children who were leading the way across these domains were those where Spanish was a dominant language in the home and or where parents had not finished high school. And so the families where kids are leading the way across all these domains are also likely to be the families that are going to need the most assistance from communities and schools when it comes to learning remotely during the pandemic. I want to show you just one more thing about what's happening in the families, if we can go to the next slide, which is that we asked about what school-age siblings are doing with each other. Because we think so much about what parents do for kids, we think a lot less about what kids do for parents, that there's a back and forth, but we really don't think a lot about what siblings do with each other. And what we found was it made a big difference whether tech use in the home and tech learning in the home was more parent-driven, meaning that parents across those 4 dimensions I showed you were leading the way predominantly versus children leading the way predominantly. And you can see that there are actually statistically significant differences in what kids do to help each other learn in those homes. That we can actually see differences where there's a trend that's set intergenerationally that affects intra-generational learning in ways that reinforce the idea that families have got significant assets that they bring to the table when it comes to learning. They've been doing these things together before the pandemic hit, and that it's all too easy to fall into a sort of deficit frame, especially of lower income or immigrant families, about what they don't have. We can focus on the things that they don't have easy access to and support them in those challenges, but we should never lose sight of the fact that they bring significant strengths to the table, and that now more than ever is the time to treat families as partners in the learning endeavor, perhaps in ways we've never really thought of before.
Yes, 100% on that. And I think it would be really great to continue that part. And maybe people can even put in the chat if there's things they're learning about families' strengths and that kind of teamwork or kind of team approach that we might see in families, and also mixed age learning, right? I want to go back and ask a question about one of the points you made earlier as well, about how the digital divide is not just about connectivity. And your research has shown that we need to recognize it's not a binary, online or offline, and that underconnected is an important kind of spectrum to understand. But I've also heard you describe that there's more to it than just whether you've got a better data plan or whether you've got enough devices in the home. So tell us, what else is part of the digital divide that we need to understand?
So if we can go to the next slide, like all educators, I love going back to basics, but
right.
Something I've been thinking about and writing about quite a bit since COVID became such a big part of our lives, is that, suddenly every school district in America, every childcare centered organization, every university, because this is something that's been a massive discussion at Rutgers, where I teach, and at other universities as well. How do we support students when technology becomes the conduit by which all learning content and engagement is going to be happening? Broadband connectivity is one piece, and ensuring that families have good and easy access to high quality and consistent connectivity is critical, but we can't stop there. We need to make sure that families have adequate devices, and that means, so you can see the BC is broadband connectivity, but devices means that they have the number of devices they need so that families aren't sharing during hours where everybody needs to have a device to themselves. You can't have kids sharing devices, if at all possible, during a school day, or that parents are waiting for their kids to finish so that they can do their work. So schools should be, and universities should be, loaning out laptops or iPads the way that we would loan out a textbook in a previous age. This notion that these are things that families can't be trusted to take home is something that a lot of districts have let go of. All of them need to. And it's not, it has to put the A first. And this is the part that I think gets left out the most, and it's probably the most important, which is assistance. Families, kids, parents are going to need to know who at school they can call when they get stuck, when that device stops working, when they don't know how to use a learning platform that they're now being required to use on a regular basis, when something goes wrong. This is the part that's the hardest to navigate for institutions, because it means having somebody available all the time. And it's the hardest thing and the most expensive in terms of time and effort and energy. But without that A, the rest of the tower falls down.
Right, right.
Because families are going to be, that is how we stop families from feeling like they are alone in this, and that we truly are trying to meet them where they are. And so this is a conversation that I've had, you know, as I said, at the university level, because universities are reckoning with this. We're reckoning with this basically all the way from preschool through graduate school, frankly, at this point. So I would plead with anybody on this call who's making these decisions to ensure that broadband connectivity is something they are petitioning loudly for the internet service providers in their community to be providing to families for free or for low cost, regardless of whether or not they have debt with those companies, which often precludes families getting online even with the low cost offers that are being made available now. That we ensure that families have the quality devices and number of devices that they need to succeed in these learning environments, and that assistance piece is front and center from the beginning and every day. Because otherwise the families that are going to slide the most are the ones that are already struggling the most. The families where parents feel less entitled to contact teachers because they are not English speaking, or they're undocumented, or they don't have a lot of formal education themselves. In order to protect the kids that are the most vulnerable to these slides, we have to ensure that they know the most important connection they have is the one to the people in their children's schools. The actual fiber connectivity is secondary to that.
Thank you so much, Vikki. Okay, that's fantastic. And I see this has generated lots of really good questions as well. So Yoli and others are checking the questions in the chat, and we're going to definitely get to those. We'll have lots of good time for questions at the end. I want to keep going now. We're going to go to a poll, actually, so that we can just get a sense from those who are with us. This is a poll that's trying to get a sense of what's happening in your own community. What efforts are underway where you're living or where you're leading in your communities to bring the internet to underserved families. And I love these polls because it's really interesting to see in real time as people are answering here. But yeah, go ahead and put your answer in, and we'll take a moment to digest this, and then we'll go up to our next panelist. So yeah, so super interesting. Right now, it looks like it's kind of neck and neck between schools and libraries distributing Wi-Fi hotspots and making Wi-Fi available in parking lots. And it's one of those things where, before the days of the pandemic, who would have thought that it would be so important to make sure that Wi-Fi extended that far out from our buildings? So great. And I see that's almost about the same now in terms of low-income families who are encouraged to sign up for the discounted internet access. We can talk about that a bit. I think Josh will have some interesting points to make around that, as well as Vikki just said too, in terms of what's really available to families or not. So terrific. Thank you so much to GLR for making this poll possible for us. I am going to go ahead now and bring Josh into the center of the conversation a bit. So Yoli introduced him earlier, but I'm thrilled to have Josh with us because he is one of my colleagues at New America, but we cross paths on some of the digital equity issues, but is actually in a different section of New America. He's part of our Open Technology Institute, does amazing work on so many of these issues, well, certainly security and privacy and net neutrality, and then this big one that we're talking about here today. So what I wanted to do is start off, Josh, with a question to you that just helps to kind of center us on what advocacy efforts may be underway right now, and what we really need to be pushing toward to solve some of these equity problems. So in your work at OTI, you've noted that federal support for internet access and these issues that we're talking about here has been really lagging behind what the need is and what we're seeing in the data. So can you tell us a little bit more about that, what you're seeing in your role, and bring us up to the current day, if you can, in terms of the various kind of stimulus legislation around the pandemic, and where these issues of digital equity are sitting in our legislation today.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the question and for hosting this event. Yeah, so as Lisa mentioned, at the Open Technology Institute, or OTI as we're typically known, we've been fighting for policies to close the digital divide and ensure universal and equitable access to the internet since our founding back in 2009. So for years, we've been fighting for policies that would tackle the broadband access problem. And for years, we've been saying that this issue is in crisis. So over the past 2 months, of course, now with the pandemic, the issue of broadband access has become an even more acute crisis. You know, a few months ago, we would have been saying the problem, especially with respect to the homework gap, was that you had kids gathering in parking lots to use Wi-Fi hotspots to complete their homework. Now they're gathering in parking lots simply to access the classroom and their teachers. That has really magnified the stakes that are associated with internet access. And because of that, we have really shifted our advocacy in the past 2 months to focusing very much on efforts that move at the speed of the virus, efforts that can connect people to the internet right now, to address the millions of Americans that Vikki mentioned who currently don't have access whatsoever to the internet or don't have sufficient access. So the good news here is that federal attention to this issue has never been stronger. There, isn't a day that goes by now that I don't get some draft bill in my inbox that is trying to tackle this issue, that is trying to find a way to connect more people to the internet. But the bad news is these are just draft bills. The federal government has not been moving fast enough. Certainly some of these measures do take time, but some of these things could have been done back in March, and OTI has been pushing the federal government, particularly Congress and the Federal Communications Commission, to enact quick changes, not infrastructure deployment things that take 18 to 24 months, but changes that can help people access, afford internet, get mobile hotspots right now. Because what's become very clear is that the lack of internet access is a public health crisis. People can't comply with stay-at-home orders. They can't comply with school closure orders if they don't have home access to online services. That includes education, but it even includes things as simple as food shopping now. People on food stamps are increasingly being told to try online grocery shopping to avoid grocery stores, but they can't do that if they don't have access to the internet. So what we have been really pushing for is to get the federal government for the past 2 months to enact a connectivity stimulus. As Lisa mentioned, the Congress has passed 3 stimulus bills back in March and early April. But unfortunately, none of them really contained the focus on broadband access that we would have liked. A lot of the focus of those bills were around things like PPE, shoring up small businesses, very important measures, but that didn't really do anything to help people address this internet question. The CARES Act, which passed in late March, was the biggest of these stimulus acts. And unfortunately, there was hope that we would get some broadband funding there, but it was stripped out at the last minute. It was deemed too controversial. What was left was about $50 million for the Institute for Museum and Library Services. But unfortunately, this funding is being pushed very slowly out the door, and it's not explicitly dedicated to internet funding. And most importantly, $50 million is a total drop in the bucket. It's just not what we asked for. What we have been pushing for are immediate connectivity measures. So the first thing to focus on here is through a program called E-Rate. This is the FCC's longstanding program to help schools and libraries fund internet connectivity historically within the walls of the school or the library. But back in March, we, along with many, many other public interest organizations and education groups, were pushing and asked the FCC to expand that E-rate funding to say, now you can use this funding schools and libraries to fund, for example, mobile hotspots, because the definition of the classroom is clearly no longer within the physical boundaries of a school. It's now in people's homes and wherever else they can access the internet. Unfortunately, the FCC has really slow-walked this. We tried to get meetings with them in April, and finally, after weeks, they back-channeled to us that they don't think they have the authority to do this. They think the legal definition of classroom means within the school. We disagree with that interpretation, but nonetheless, Congress can give them that authority, and Congress did pass in legislation 2 weeks ago called the HEROES Act, this authority along with $5 billion to expand E-rate. So that HEROES Act passed the House 2 weeks ago, but it has immediately stalled in the Senate, where the Senate leader, Mitch McConnell, has said it is all but dead on arrival. Also in the HEROES Act included critical support for the other big program that we've been pushing for, the Lifeline program. So this is the FCC's program that since the 1980s has been subsidizing phone service for low-income Americans, and for the past few years has also been subsidizing internet service. We want to see a dramatic expansion of this. This is a program that is already there, ready to go, that if it was just ramped up, could immediately help more people afford the internet, especially if they've fallen on hard times and are dealing with affordability problems. Similarly, we have been pushing for the Lifeline program not only to be expanded, but that it continues to support the devices, not just the connectivity. And there have been proposals at the FCC over the years to actually cut off that device support, and we want to see the FCC formally abandon that and make clear that actually devices will continue to be supported. Some of this came in the HEROES Act, which again was stalled. The FCC has not acted on any of these requests. But then there is also, relatedly, in the HEROES Act, Congress responded by creating something called the Emergency Broadband Benefit. This is a very similar program to Lifeline, except that it would be brand new. And it would focus a $50 a month subsidy to a large swath of Americans, not just low-income Americans. It could include people who have recently signed up for unemployment, lost their jobs, potentially people who maybe are Pell Grant eligible. It's designed to be a much more emergency pandemic-focused program. And we have been working a lot with the sponsors of this legislation to get that program working as best as it could, because standing up a new federal program is a very time-consuming thing, and implementation could take a very long time. But the biggest challenge that we have right now is, once again, it has gone nowhere in the Senate. So that is the overview of some of what's going on in Congress. The other thing to mention at the federal level that some of you may have heard about is this thing called the Keep Americans Connected pledge. This is something that the FCC sort of announced back in March, where they said that voluntarily many internet providers have agreed to commit to primarily two things in this pledge. They won't disconnect people during the pandemic if they cannot afford service because of some COVID-related hardship. The second thing is that they agree that they would open up their Wi-Fi hotspots so that people can use them wherever they are available. Mm-hmm. So we certainly support this pledge. We support all voluntary action that internet providers are taking. But what's really important to note here is that the FCC actually doesn't have any authority here. For the past 3 years, they have been retreating from their role as the expert agency in charge of being essentially the cop on the beat for this broadband market. And they repealed their legal authority back in 2017. So without that legal authority, they actually can't compel internet providers to do anything with this pledge. They can't enforce it. All they can do is simply announce in press releases that this pledge exists. So this has been problematic because we have now been trying to figure out, are the providers keeping up with this pledge? Are they actually, and we've been hearing reports that actually people continue to get disconnected even though they are facing hardships. We're also seeing a lot of problems with Wi-Fi hotspots. There's a rally going on in Baltimore just this morning where a lot of schools actually have been pushing Comcast, the provider there, to open up their residential hotspots. They have not opened up the residential hotspots despite what's in this pledge. So this is something that is really, it's on a wing and a prayer. We don't have leadership here. It's voluntary action.
Thank you so much, Josh. Yeah, so in quite a state of affairs that we're in on so many of these pieces, let me ask, so I want to make sure that we're thinking about time here. For those of us who on the webinar who are coming from a state or local perspective, what advice might you have for them, or where should they be kind of allocating resources or making the push right now? What can folks in those roles do?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that's something that we have, a lot of our advocacy is focused on, essentially having the federal government remove barriers so that states and localities can innovate and can provide the kind of on-the-ground connectivity, because that's where we've been seeing most of the action. most of the efforts to get especially students connected over the past 2 months has been coming from that on the ground level. One of the things that we need to do, though, is remove some of the legal barriers that exist in a lot of states. Not a day goes by now that I don't hear of a story of a locality doing great things. I just, over the weekend, the latest one was Lindsay, California, in the Central Valley of California. It's an area where 100% of the students qualify for free lunch. And they actually deployed a community Wi-Fi network about 4 years ago that provides free filtered service to all 4,000 of their students in their homes. So when they shifted to these shelter-in-place orders a couple of months ago, they were ready to go. And that's, a great example of something that localities are doing, but that's happening in California. And that doesn't happen in every state. So for example, in Virginia, they have a state law that restricts community broadband networks from existing, and the state legislature there needs to repeal that law. They were hoping to get to that back in February when the legislature was in session, but they didn't. So a lot of states and localities simply have handcuffs on them if they want to do this. Another thing to keep in mind is to be aware of local franchise authority. So in just about every city or town in the country, if you have a private internet provider, that's actually being delivered to a home or a school on the basis of some kind of local authority. When they dig up the streets, for example, to install fiber, that's a public right of way. And at some level, the local government has given them access to that public right of way through a local franchise. Now, this authority is something that a lot of cities don't actually leverage. They often will just rubber stamp it and say, sure, Comcast, sure, AT&T, you can build out. But in some more innovative cities that have been focused on this authority have said, yes, you can actually build out in our community, but with some conditions. For example, universal service, connecting to schools. Leveraging this authority is something that many, many localities could take advantage of to help get particularly students connected.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Josh. I'm going to have to move us to the next speaker, but I'm so appreciative of you being on to give us a rundown on this. And I just put on screen for those who are following along another great resource. If you don't know about NDIA, and they've got state government and local government options there on their website for you. You can go there as well. So thanks again, Josh. And we'll have some questions coming in for you at the end. So now I'm going to move us over to our community respondents who are really our leaders on this. They're on the front lines of it all, but they're also innovating in such amazing ways. So I'm going to quickly introduce our next speaker. I'll stop sharing my screen here for a moment so we can make sure we see Tina. And I just want to make sure I've got the correct bio for you, Tina. Yes, so Tina Hike-Hubbard is going to join us now for this part of the conversation. She's Chief of Communications, Engagement, and Enrollment for Baltimore City Public Schools. She began her education career as a Teach for America TFA member and teaching social studies at West Baltimore Middle School. For most of her career, Ms. Hike-Hubbard has worked for Enterprise Community Partners, where she served as Senior Director for the Mid-Atlantic region. And she's developed and managed a comprehensive kind of school and community reform effort for the city in Baltimore. For 8 years, Ms. Hike-Hubbard was appointed to the Baltimore City Public Schools Board of Commissioners. That's a tough job, super impressed, during which she served 2 years as vice chair. So it's fantastic, Tina, to have you with us today. And I know that you also have some slides to share, so I'll let you get to those. What I wanted to do to kind of open it up was just ask you in just a general way, given these issues that we've kind of put on the table here, what are you seeing for the city of Baltimore, but most importantly for the students and the young children coming through Baltimore's programs and Baltimore City schools? What's most striking to you about some of the inequities that we need to address?
Thank you for having me. Excited to talk about that today. Honestly, in Baltimore, we've started doing racial equity work in general, pledging that we just passed a racial equity policy recently. And this digital divide is no stranger to the racial equity conversation, right? So we've been doing a lot of work on trying to figure out how we create equity for our students. And I would say not having imperfect data has been the hardest thing for us, of understanding who is connected, who has the right devices, that kind of thing has been the struggle we've been enduring. So I'll go into our presentation quickly because I know we have limited time. So I'm going to go through our COVID timeline. So our closure started around March 12th. Schools were announced closed. They began the following Monday. We had to stand up 18 emergency meal sites and then begin packet distribution for our students as soon as that happened. And then we had to develop a long-term strategy, right, for remote learning as well as technology distribution. So we developed a survey for our families, both online and via phone, just to understand not only the food, but also technology needs of our families, both device and connectivity. And so we had about, out of a district of 79,000 students, we had about 48,000 responders to the survey. So, you know, you could say that some of those who didn't respond had devices, had support, so they didn't respond because they didn't need to. I think the majority of those who didn't respond weren't connected, right? And so that's the struggle we had, is trying to figure out from a district-wide perspective survey as well as a school-based survey what families actually needed during this time. We had our spring break, which really wasn't a spring break. We upstood our distance learning during that time. Then we reopened our meal sites and everything on March 30th. From there, we launched distance learning for students, which I'll nuance in just a moment. We began Chromebook distribution April 15th, and I will go into detail about that. Now we've begun our education recovery planning, not only for summer, but also the fall, and doing scenario planning and what that looks like. But our announcement for schools being closed was announced on May 6th this year. The next slide. So our priorities during this time period, we're talking about that today, but food became our #1 priority. You talk about equity issues, you talk about resources. While devices and connectivity were important, we had a simple basic need of getting food to our families. We spent a lot of time figuring out how to do that. Then the other two major issues for us were devices and distance learning, as well as connectivity for our students. So I won't go into the food slide detail, but you can just see the numbers here of what we were actually trying to do with this food issue. Serving 300,000 meals throughout our 18 meal sites. I mean, it's been more than a notion just to get our families fed, let alone figure out how to get computers out to our kids. So distance learning. This slide talks about the fact that we have 85% of our students that are engaged in distance learning. The reality, though, is when we say distance learning, we have it in 3 ways, right? We have packets that are at our meal site. So we have packets that are delivered every single week for kids by grade level at our meal sites for those who are not
print, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. And we also then commandeered both our local television station that City Schools operates, cable channel, as well as the city's local station. And we actually broadcast lessons on the television that correspond to those packets. So we're also counting those students as being connected if we have them online. And the rest of the ones we're talking about being connected are those who are literally engaging online with their classroom teachers or getting into Google Classroom. So we have our printed packets, as the slide said. We have our K-8 lessons on the television screen. We have our family guides weekly. We have synchronous and asynchronous teacher-led online instruction. And just for a moment, we have asked that every teacher in our district find a way to touch our students at least twice. And that could be online. Students who are not online, it's a phone call. We've had people doing home visits, social distancing, obviously, but really trying to understand where our kids are. We frankly figured out that of all of our kids, we had about 8,000 students we were not touching on a regular basis. And now we're doing wellness checks on all of those kids just to make sure we know where they are, but also get them connected to learning as quickly as possible. And then we also launched an academic support hotline. So that families needed support during this time to understand their students' lessons and whatnot, they could call the hotline and get support directly at the district level. So this device distribution was more than a notion. We were not a one-for-one district. We did not have the capacity to give out devices to all of our kids in the short term or in the immediate. So we began to uncover both what we had in our schools and also what we needed to purchase. So we had about 15,000 computers we understood in our schools. And we went through and did a viability check on all those computers to make sure they had what they needed. We also realized many of them were on laptop carts. And computers don't work if they're not on laptop carts. We literally ordered $400,000 worth of cords, just so those computers could work outside of the school. We also then purchased about 12,200 computers to begin to distribute to our students. So our first round distribution, we distributed about 12,000 devices to our students across the district. We prioritized our juniors and seniors first to complete credit recovery to make sure they could graduate. And then we began to do down the line. The computers we purchased went to those juniors and seniors first. And then once we did that, we actually allowed individual schools, based on the survey data we found and individual school data, to give out computers to their own school communities and manage the distribution. And you can imagine with 79,000 students and the massive amount of kids who need computers, and also safety of our kids getting back and forth to our schools to pick up a device, it was a really big undertaking to make sure we had social distancing, the computers were ready to go, et cetera. Go to the next slide. So the American Community Survey, the ABLE Foundation recently did a report based on the American Community Survey, which suggested the following for Baltimore specifically, that 96,000 households in Baltimore did not have a wireline internet, right? Or 1 in 3 do not either have a desktop or laptop computer. 19,200 households with children do not have broadband connectivity, and nearly 20,000 households with our children and them do not have a wireline or broadband computers at home. This actually gave us more impetus to think about how we're doing our fundraising strategies, how we're prioritizing our connectivity issues, and how we're making sure we get kids the devices that they need to be successful. So our landscape prioritization. So we had internally, we figured out 13,000 Chromebooks we could distribute. We actually ended up purchasing more after our first purchase. We now have 15,700 computers we've purchased, either refurbished or brand new, that we are distributing. Working with a variety of partners also on refurbished devices. We have partners who, you know, I get emails every day saying, I want to donate a device to a student, and it's just not that simple to take a donated device, right? Chromebooks were our method of the madness because our IT department can provide direct support. We could actually manage what students were doing online. We also provide the technology training and support for teachers and students, but Chromebooks was our choice. We also have partners who are refurbishing them and getting them out. But again, we prioritize high schools and then following K-8 after that. Next slide. So our device distribution began on April 13th. We've done about 40% of our schools, and our second round began May 18th. We anticipate, again, that we need about 20,000 computers to get out to our kids to sort of alleviate this divide. And let's be clear, the school year is coming to an end, right? We are loaning these computers out to kids. The only ones we're collecting back right now are those graduating seniors who are leaving us. So students can actually use their devices over the summer for either our direct summer engagement or partner summer engagement. But then in the fall, as I said earlier, we're doing scenario planning. We're not sure what's going to happen in the fall. We could be all remote, we could be partially remote, A/B schedule kind of thing. And so we need to make sure that our students have computers available to them, but we also are now depleting our resources at our schools. And so we're also making sure that we're investing resources through the CARES Act, like I mentioned, who we heard mentioned earlier from Josh, that we are replacing some of those computers we're pulling out in schools. We don't know what condition our computers are going to come back in, right? And we are holding families accountable somewhat for those device return. We also realize the reality of the situation, that they might come back needing repair or whatnot. So we want to make sure that we are not depleting our already limited resources inside of our schools. So we have some sort of hybrid model. We have to have things in schools to support our students. So connectivity, that's the biggest one we're working on right now. We've kind of tackled the device thing. We're continuing to buy more, but the connectivity has been the biggest challenge for us. So as soon as the closure was announced, I got on the phone with Comcast, with my team, to work through how we could support. That's the internet provider of choice in Baltimore. They have the predominant contract, and I literally was able to work with them. They've been actually a fabulous partner to us in mitigating those barriers that are created. So I mentioned earlier about, you know, having a back debt and not being able to get the free internet, right? Or needing to have a social security card, which many of our families do not if they are immigrant families. And so we've been able to sort of get rid of some of those barriers. And so regardless of any past debt, all of our families would get the 2 months free of internet service, which was fantastic. We actually got Comcast to move back from a social security card to at least some kind of ID so they could identify who the family was receiving the support. But now we're having to work through, what does the extension look like? If families signed on the beginning of our closure, they're now at their 2-month window almost, or past. And so we need to figure out a way to either work with Comcast, as you heard Josh mention, we had students doing a rally today around hotspots. It's also extending the free internet that they've had for a certain time period. And they've also offered us the ability for this district to pay for short term to continue the Comcast service. But I want to take a moment just to say here that we are taking on, as a school district, a public utility conversation, right? We are actually managing internet for our city. And I would propose that our city needs to think about, as Josh mentioned, a community Wi-Fi or a municipal Wi-Fi option, because frankly, the district can't sustain this long term. We knew we needed to do it in the short term, and it's the right thing to do to make sure we have equity for our kids and our families. But the truth is, we can't sustain it long term. We don't have the budget for it. Luckily, we are using our CARES Act funding to do some internet connectivity work, bridges of hotspots and that kind of thing. But long term, we really need our city and our state and our federal folks to come forward and recognize we need to have a long-term internet strategy for our families. A couple other things we want to highlight: our mesh network is a strategy where you put a signal on a school or a library. We're right now using it for our schools and creating a network in a community that's blasted out from our schools into the community. It does require some hardware being placed. We have a lot of row homes in Baltimore, so they're close together. You could actually put antenna on the outside of the ends of the block of the row homes, and then families can get what's called like a modem inside their home to connect that broadcast signal out. So we don't have to have families in parking lots. It is a proof of concept strategy right now. We have a partner with Digital Harbor Foundation and DigiBeMore and the Waves Project of thinking through how we can do this with 4 schools right now. And frankly, we picked those 4 schools because those schools have the highest number of students who had immigrated to this country who were having a harder time than any getting on our broadband options. So we're testing that out right now. They're putting them on the schools as we speak. We are looking for an increased connectivity from our students, but also just them being able to access the online learning, right? And if we do have a lot of funders who want to help broaden the strategy, but we're really going to have a braided approach. We need to have Comcast or a broadband approach, the mesh network where it works. It's not going to work in all of our communities. And then we need to figure out in the last bullet how we provide low-cost internet hotspots for students where the connectivity for Comcast doesn't work or mesh networks doesn't work. So that's our braided strategy right now. It will take us about 6 months to a year, but beyond that, we are going to be struggling if we don't have some kind of civic engagement around internet connectivity.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much, Tina.
Yes.
Really a lot of good things to think about there, and to see what the school district's doing in leadership. I mean, the city, you're absolutely right, needs to be eventually the city doing this too, but to see that kind of stepping up is pretty amazing and inspiring. So I'm going to quickly move us to our next and last amazing speaker, presenter, and then we'll get in some questions. So Elizabeth Galicia is with us. She's Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at Common Sense Media. She's got just so much experience across these issues, whether it's communications and media and policy. It's also at Mother Jones, so another journalist colleague. And I just want to say thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining us. What I wanted to do is give you a chance to respond to what you've heard, and then tell us from your perspective what are going to be some of the key issues, especially as I know that you've been really working with the Latinx community across Common Sense Media and in certain areas of the country as well. So tell us kind of what you're seeing on the ground. Great.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you to the campaign for grade level reading for including Common Sense in this important conversation. You know, we have been, in addition to providing ratings and reviews and supporting families for the past 15 years around digital access and access to technology and opportunities in technology, we have done policy advocacy work as part of that. So we've been advocating for E-rate and Lifeline and closing the digital divide, and have been alongside OTI and the efforts recently to really focus in on where can we see a robust response given where we are with remote learning. And you know, part of that, part of what we decided to do early on, we had done some original research the past several years, including a research project last year around the homework gap. And some of you may know FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenwortzel coined that term around something you well know as educators, that more and more, if you are assigning homework then online, are kids able to access that homework? It's now work period, not homework. And we found that 70% of educators were assigning homework online, or when they were deciding not to, it was around equity challenges, and really seeing, without not being in crisis, just the lengths that students and teachers were having to go to learn, really paying to do their homework by buying something at Starbucks, that sort of thing. And we've been working on legislative solutions there. We had a bill to try to address the homework gap with existing, there's in some states, which we hope states will take advantage of. There's digital divide funds, which they can provide additional E-rate funding for schools and libraries to help close that homework gap. So we hope, we're trying to look at a state to state level, and there's actually, it is California, but there is a bill that is being heard this evening, actually, that would provide fiber across the state. It's a broadband for all bill, and if we can push California to be on the leading edge of closing the digital divide for good, and really recognizing, I saw in one of the Q&A questions around the Federal Digital Equity Act and the need for access and connectivity to broadband to be an essential utility. We need to establish that as a precedent, and then really expect that to be the bar across the country. So that's some of the work we've been doing. And for this effort, we actually launched and we'll put this in the chat, a campaign called Connect All Students, where we really want to hear from educators across the country. So Common Sense is in half of US schools. We have a digital citizenship curriculum to build the digital literacy skills, and maybe some of our participants are Common Sense educators. And we really wanted to hear from both students and families as they're navigating teaching and learning in the digital divide. And so we now have a couple of hundred stories from 40 states across the country of the lengths that teachers and families and students are going through to try to learn in this environment. And, we are really hearing that it isn't as simple, much as, as Vikki alluded to, the idea of mobile only, there's a lot of families, and we're hearing from a lot of Latinx families. We have a whole program, Common Sense Latino, that supports Latinx families in building digital literacy skills and providing resources and materials in Spanish. And we've really found that particularly for Latinx communities, digital literacy skills in that A and the ABCD is critical. So first of all, they may be mobile only, and then they're using a hotspot to try to connect their mobile device, and everything is slow, so slow, and you have, students are having to be imminently patient just to watch, say, a 2-minute video. But even to have parents understand, have families understand all of these digital tools and platforms that are, for the most part, in English and not in Spanish. I will note, and Lisa, you mentioned Wide Open School at the beginning, which is a platform that provides free resources for educators and families. That is launching in Spanish on June 1st. So we'll have those resources. But so we're also seeing from families saying, and there was actually an EdTrust West survey that came out about a month ago that found that a quarter of families are saying that, of English language learner families are saying the resources they have for remote learning are in English only. So having resources in other languages, in Spanish, and a range of languages being accessible. So families can get on that steep learning curve to understand how to use these tools is really critical. We have a video series on a bilingual video series on how to use Zoom and Class Dojo and some of these tools, but we have a long way to go to kind of get families to where they really feel like they have confidence in using these tools. And also I would mention free trials are challenging, and there is a question in the chat about is big tech stepping up, and I do think you see Apple and Google with devices and hotspots, and Comcast and AT&T, and they're saying, we're getting rid of data caps, and you have this, 60-day trials. And I think there's a concern that once that they sign up, then that time is up, or they're going to be charged. Or even with devices, we've heard from immigrant communities where, well, I can get a free device, but I have to fill out all this paperwork, so I'm actually not going to do that. Then they don't have a device, and they're left without. So, there's a range of those challenges. And I think one other data point we're hearing is, and part of it is a lot of the research that was done, we have yet to see sort of what the landscape looks like post school closures.
Right.
So that's really needed. We do a census every 2 years around technology use for young people, and we have a 0 to 8 census coming out in a couple of months. It's probably a couple of weeks. It's almost June. And we looked at technology use in the household for children 0 to 8 and found, and this data was gathered, and we're actually back out in the field to gather data for now and see how it compares. But for lower income households, 62% have a computer at home, and higher income households, that number is 95%. Whereas for phone usage, it's all about 95 or 98%.
Right.
But when it comes to this learning and connectivity that needs to happen for learning, but also access to food resources, telemedicine, and that all has to happen in a home on whatever devices there are, becomes a huge challenge.
Yeah. Wow, thank you. It's really important to hear all of that context. So I'm going to turn it over now to Yoli, who's going to take us through a couple of the questions that have come up in the Q&A. And I just want to, just say a big thank you to all of the panelists, because this has been such a rich discussion. So thank you, and Yoli, over to you.
Wonderful, thank you. What rich conversation and information and data and guidance. I really appreciate all of you for really helping us all learn a little bit more so that we're better equipped to lead this change that is so necessary. And there are a lot of questions, so we'll try to get through as many of them. Dr. Katz, I'm going to bring it back to you to start us off. There were some questions about your data and the research that you did, and two people actually asked about rural communities and what you saw in your data in terms of any differences between rural and urban.
We did not, and remember these data were collected before school closures, but we did not find significant differences for the most part between urban, suburban, and rural. And part of that is because people, I think, there's a common perception that urban, being denser and geographically concentrated, that there are more options and opportunities, and certainly in some sense that's correct, but I think Tina would attest to the fact that urban does not mean that you don't have major issues with connectivity. We talk about, many of you will be familiar with the term redlining in relation to, to purchasing homes and so forth. We talk about digital redlining too, where internet service providers decide that the demographics of an area simply don't compute economically because they're making presumptions about who's going to be able to afford their services to the extent that they recoup the cost. And so we find that in the same way that a lot of urban centers are, healthy foods, have trouble, maintaining, accessing healthy food, what we call food deserts and so forth. We can find digital deserts there too. And so I think when you're asking these questions about these sorts of textured access issues, the reasons why rural communities would be having trouble might be different from the urban ones, but the challenges they're facing on a day-to-day probably feel fairly similar from the parents' perspective.
Lots of questions and comments in the chat box about parents, about supporting parents. So I want as many of you to weigh in here to some of these questions. The first was around really recognizing that parents are in the front seat right now in terms of helping their children with learning. So are there some best practices we can learn from about how we're supporting parents, helping them navigate and effectively use software, building their skills and their competencies? Recently, Gloria Corral from Beacon shared that in the interviews of over 1,000 Spanish-speaking immigrant families in California, that some of the basics are just not there for many of our families. They don't know what a URL is. Mm-hmm. They don't know what Google Classroom is. And so, there's a lot of support, information, and guidance. And so who's doing some of this best work, and what might you have to share about that?
I would think that basically what Tina described to me is sounded like a set of best practices that you'd have trouble matching with any district I've ever worked with or heard of anywhere in the country. So Tina, I take my hat off to you and your colleagues. The going door to door when family, the literally meeting families where they are with the things that they need has to be an unbelievably challenging thing to organize and orchestrate. But I would think that, you know, whatever guidance you have to share on that from the ground, I've never heard so comprehensive and thoughtful a plan for dealing with these issues in the midst of such challenges.
So Tina, you might expect phone calls and emails. We've put all of your information, your social media handles, and I know people want to learn from you. So I hope that you will be able to share as much as you can with people that want to follow up with you or that maybe didn't participate but heard about the work in Baltimore.
Yeah, absolutely. We're happy to do that. I would also just offer that, you know, we couldn't find our kids, right? And it pained me that we could not figure out based on phone number changes or address changes where all of our kids were. And so figuring that out was really critical. We're also doing virtual listening tours, both online and over the phone, to understand what parents' real experience is right now. So we can actually design the right training over the summer. We threw up, you know, generic training about how to get on Google Classroom on our website. That's fine. It was a short-term solution. But after listening to our families, we're now going to design training over the summer that really addresses what their needs are and recognizes the challenges that we all face. I have my own 10-year-old. I was telling I want Dark to get back on his classroom right now, right? I mean, it's a real thing that we all have. And if I'm struggling, I can't imagine how many of our other families are struggling. So we just need to hear from them and then design based on what they're telling us that they need. And I do have to hop off, so I really thank you all for having me come today. Happy to come back and talk anymore. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Elizabeth, I'll turn to you about what you're seeing and the experiences on the ground. Angela shared that some families are deterred from accepting laptops and Chromebooks because when they become available, there's fear that they will be broken or damaged. In one of their districts that was providing devices, they had families sign a contract that stated that if anything happens to the device, the family would be responsible for a $600 replacement fee. Are there some best practices where we can sort of deter districts from doing this and really encourage them to see why this is so valuable for families and why these contracts just are going to hamper the learning for our kids?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to have to come up with new guidelines and contracts for this to navigate what it means to remote learn first, or to have remote learning be such an integral part of navigating what is a classroom and what is teaching. So, you know, I think that some of that will happen, and, you know, the care that educators, you know, Tina talking about virtual listening sessions and coming up with really a new kind of rubric and framework over summer when they actually should be able to take time off and recharge is, you know, it's going to be a monumental effort. And I think that districts are also going to have to rethink what that looks like in terms of what they're asking of families when it comes to things like, and it's similar to what we heard of, well, I won't take it because I feel like the paperwork is daunting. We have to eliminate those barriers and have as few barriers as possible to make learning as, you know, to really help families eliminate what are some of these challenges.
I'll tell you that we did interviews in a district in Arizona back when the Sensenbrenner bill was in effect. And it was a one-to-one district that had a considerable amount of money to spend on these things. And they sent these devices home in the hopes that every family member would use them. And we interviewed family after family, because we interviewed 60 randomly selected families, where parents never touched these devices because they were undocumented. And they would skirt going around the computer from the back so that the cameras could never catch them. And it was because of these contracts. It was because of contracts that made it sound like they could be looking at anything you were doing at any time. And it wasn't that the district was trying to instill fear, but that they were used to using a particular sort of language. And I think that the critical issue here is for districts to start with what is the end goal in mind. And that is to ensure that families have as broad and deep access to that device as they can in these conditions. Work backwards from that, and you will end up with a contract that families have to sign that is as non-onerous as possible, because that has to be what we try to do. We should not be throwing up any more boundaries to families in the midst of all of this if what we're trying to do is ensure equitable access to learning.
Thank you for adding to that. Josh, I want to turn back to you. There were a few questions about some of the federal issues that you talked about. If you could just repeat the stimulus that you were working on. I know you talked about E-rate and Lifeline, and there were a few others, and there were questions. People didn't quite catch that. They were probably writing as fast as they could. And then if you also could chime in on the rural issue and whether that's getting captured in any of the legislation.
Sure. Well, so at present, the only stimulus bill that is active is called the HEROES Act. And it's an acronym that the Hill likes to do that. I forget what it stands for, but that's the bill that passed the House 2 weeks ago and is stalled in the Senate. But all of the measures I talked about, whether it was E-rate, Lifeline, anything else, are also being introduced as standalone bills. So, I mean, we'll work on any of these bills. The vehicle at this point doesn't really matter, and there hasn't been a lot of coalescing around one particular vehicle. But the best one we have so far is the HEROES Act. On the question of the rural issues, so yeah, this is this is really bread and butter for OTI over the years, where we've really tried to focus on the fact that, right, there's a rural divide where it's largely an access problem, where there are so many communities that have no internet providers. But then, of course, on the more urban side of things, they're lucky to have one or maybe two providers. And, that's, in legal terms, that's called a monopoly or a duopoly, which means you have dramatically overpriced service that people can't afford, which in some cases is just as bad as not having any service. So this is really a really big challenge right now, though, addressing the rural question, because we, as I mentioned, we are in triage mode right now. To what can we do in the short term to get people connected? And a lot of the measures to get connected to rural America, it's a problem of infrastructure and deployment. And you simply cannot build out to those rural areas, even if you massively subsidized it overnight. The other big problem is that the FCC has been struggling for years to actually get accurate maps of what areas don't have service after all these years. We literally don't know what areas of the country have no internet service. So we've done this in the past, where the FCC has tried to dole out federal funds to subsidize build out to rural areas, only to find that the money wasn't directed to the right places because they don't know where to go. So in the very short term, the rural question is a huge crisis, but there are no short-term answers, I have to say. So a lot of the focus around hotspots and using things like Internet Essentials is very much limited to the communities that are dense enough to have access to those services.
Right, so much work for us to do and pay attention to. I want to call to your attention that in just a minute, Jerry is going to put up another poll, and this is really for you to give us feedback. So as we finish up the questions, please take a moment and respond to the poll so that we know how to continue to better serve your learning needs. Let's see, I'm going to try to get to two more questions. One was around supporting teachers and professional development and the tools that they need, really the information around the technology changes, staying up to date. Could one of you speak to what's happening within school systems around preparing educators to really teach in a digital world now? Lisa, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in to get us started on that, because it's huge. It's a huge issue. And right now, we at New America are about to release a pandemic planning for distance learning resource that'll come out tomorrow, and it has a whole section on professional learning in there. But it's mostly about the questions that we need to ask and the considerations that are so important. For one, there's not enough recognition that the kind of professional development that teachers need is not just, here's the manual on how to use this new tool. It's often more than that. It's how to integrate that into the content and the subject area, and to recognize some of the social emotional learning and other kinds of relationship building that can be built with the technologies. And often teachers don't get enough of their own hands-on time to use these tools. to figure out how to best adapt them for their own classrooms. So we certainly have been advocating at New America for much more job embedded kind of professional development, ongoing professional development. We're going to need to see more of that. Absolutely, it's going to have to happen over the summer. Teachers definitely need breaks, there's no question, but they're also, I think, ready to give it a shot and want more of this professional learning. And then they're going to need it throughout the school year. And how schools do this when their budgets are crunched and they're trying to figure out how to roll out all these new devices is going to be a challenge. So we'll have to give everybody a little bit of grace, but keep the pressure on to make sure that there is some professional learning for our teachers.
Great. Any other thoughts on this question on preparing teachers' professional development? Okay, then I'll go on to the next question.
I'll just add one more thing in terms of a resource. So if those who don't already know about ISTE, the International Society for Technology and Education, I'll put the link in the chat. They have an early learning network, and they've been running a series of really good webinars on this. So I'll put that in the chat for everybody.
Wonderful. Let's talk a little bit about big tech and maybe some of the internet providers. Josh, jump in here if you can. The question was around whether communities could join together to negotiate with internet providers. Tina mentioned Comcast, which has a virtual monopoly in Philadelphia, apparently. And she goes on to say, it would stand to reason that we could advocate more successfully with them to sustain a comprehensive broadband effort for low-income individuals if we were doing so as a mighty group of cities and regions. Would love your thoughts, each of you, on that. It's a powerful question.
Yeah, I love the ambition behind that question, and of course that's somebody from Philadelphia, because it's not only Comcast's hometown, but it's actually the best model for what I talked about earlier in leveraging the local franchise authority. One of, if not the only large city to ever really do this was Philadelphia a few years ago, back when they were renewing their franchise authority. They got public hearings. There was a lot of grassroots energy around trying to hold Comcast accountable for the access that they get through public rights of way. So, if the idea of actually grouping together localities is, like I said, ambitious. It's not something that we've really thought much about, simply because most other cities are so far behind what Philadelphia has been doing. We just struggled to get some cities, for example, like Minneapolis renewed their Comcast franchise a few years ago. That the only condition they attached was they realized Comcast owed City Hall like $300,000 in back paid bills, and they just said, well, if you actually bother to pay that bill, then we'll renew it. And like that kind of rubber stamping is what we're dealing with. So I love the idea, and certainly leveraging community power against some of these monopoly providers would be really powerful. But this could also come at the federal level. It's a shame that localities even have to be thinking about this, because they're doing this in the absence of federal leadership.
Yep, other thoughts? Elizabeth, chime in. I'm sure that this has come up to your attention as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're going to have to see, I mean, I agree with Josh. I think it's going to be all hands on deck. We're going to try, there's going to be some localities that are going to push and be successful with, and I would say, there is momentum. There is a policy window to sort of see change and to push on what have been monopolies that have not kind of budged in their policy because they have so much power. At the same time, what we need now are those sustainable solutions that need to come at the federal level and perhaps at the state level. And I think that, it's one thing, and we are right now for good reason focused on what is emergency response, how can we make sure schools get what they need in this moment. But the response, the HEROES Act is not going to be the last bill we see on this, and we have to be thinking about long-term, knowing that we're going to move into the rest of 2020 and 2021 with remote learning being part of how we navigate education. Then we have to rethink how people are able to access opportunity and technology and education in their homes. And we have to reset the terms with some of these companies that have really set their own terms to date.
Great, thank you. I'm going to wrap us up. If there are any final words, comments, recommendations to the network at the campaign for grade level reading, chime in, and then I will wrap us up, talk about the next few webinars, and thank all of you. Lisa, anything on your end before I do the quick closing?
Nope. I think we're all set. This has just been fantastic. So many good ideas. I mean, we're in a tough spot, and our families are in a really tough spot, but the energy and the ideas that are coming through here, I think, is exactly what we need on this issue.
Great, thank you. Well, this is one of various and sundry issues that we will cover during the rest of this month and the month of June at the campaign. So please join us for the next series, the next in a series of webinars. You'll see the next two that I talked about earlier this afternoon, the June 2nd on the science of learning loss, and then on June 9th, supporting parents at home. And we'll talk about some of those essential opportunities and initiatives and programs that are available to parents to support them. So we hope that you will join us. And with that, let me just thank all of you. Lisa Guernsey is such a treasure to the campaign, and so to have you join us and moderate and co-host with us, we're absolutely grateful. Thank you. Thank you to Dr. Vikki Katz at Rutgers University. Thank you to Joshua Steger at OTI. We lost Tina a few minutes ago from Baltimore City Schools, but Tina, thank you. And Elizabeth Galicia at Common Sense Media. Thank you all. Look forward to the next webinar. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Well, thank you.